I'm thrilled that we have so many people here today for What It Means to Be Human, a conversation about the body, medicine, and bioethics. I'm Michael West. I teach English here at the University of Dallas, and I'm also the Outreach Director in the Liberal Learning for Life program. At Liberal Learning for Life, we cultivate, connect, and create lifelong lovers of the liberal arts. We host events such as this one. We create online video series through our Studies in Catholic Faith and Culture program. We support the Arts of Liberty project for lovers of classical education, and we produce the Liberal Learning for Life podcast. You can learn more about what we do at udallas.edu/liberallearning. And we're joined today by two guests, Professor Carter Snead and Dr. William Stigall. Carter Snead is director of the De Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture, professor of law, and concurrent professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He's a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, the principal bioethics advisory body to Pope Francis, and a fellow of the Hastings Center. Dr. William Stigall is a pediatric critical care physician and bioethicist. He attends in the Cook Children's Medical Center Pediatric ICU and is on the clinical faculty for the TCU School of Medicine in Pediatrics and Ethics. Dr. Stigall also has an MA in philosophy and regularly teaches courses in bioethics in the philosophy department at the University of Dallas. Here's the plan for this hour. Professor Snead will speak for 10 minutes, and then Dr. Stigall for 10 minutes. I'll then ask a question or two to both of you, and we'll begin working through some questions from our audience around 2:40. So as our panelists are speaking, I invite audience members to type your questions into the Q&A box on your screen, and you have the option to ask a question anonymously or to ask a question with your name on it. Both are fine. And with that, Professor Snead, you have the floor.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I just unmuted myself. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. First of all, I want to thank you, Michael, and the University of Dallas for inviting me to discuss my book today. And I'm really grateful for Dr. Stigall's participation. I know he's busy, and it's wonderful to have conversation with such thoughtful and interesting folks. And thanks to all the participants as well who took a Thursday afternoon to join us for conversation. My remarks are going to be very short. I would like to. I'm more interested in conversation than I am in lecturing. I'm sure the audience is as well. And so I'm just going to very briefly summarize the two claims of the book without elaborating on them. We can do that in our conversation if that's the direction our engagement takes. So the book is What It Means to Be Human, the Case for the Body in Public Bioethics. And it makes two fundamental claims. One is a kind of methodological claim, and one is a substantive claim that follows from the methodological claim. The methodological claim is that the richest point of entry into understanding any area of law and public policy, but especially the area of law and policy that I call American public bioethics, that is, the governance of science, medicine, and biotechnology in the name of ethical goods, not merely intellectual reflection and discussion, but actually the point at which the political branches and the judicial branch of government come into contact with these ethical questions and legislate or interpret the law or take administrative action or what have you, or even just simply create the space within which civil society can operate on its own to privately order and configure lives according to the best normative judgment of the people involved. So the claim is that the richest way to understand American public bioethics is by asking the question, what vision of the human person and human flourishing underwrites and undergirds the laws and policies in this area? Now, a person who's not a legal scholar or has thought much about the law might wonder, well, what does that have to do? What is this anthropology meant in its sort of original sense of what it means to be human and to flourish as a human being? What does that have to do with law, and why is that useful for understanding law? And the reason is this. First of all law is irreducibly normative. There's no separation between law and matters of judgment, normative conclusions, principles of justice, principles of freedom, moral judgments, because every single law that exists and every single public policy that exists aims to pursue a particular good or to avoid a particular evil. And the richest first level of understanding is to ask the question of what good is being pursued here, what harm is being avoided here, and is there a good fit between those purposes and the mechanisms of the law? But even more deeply than that, law is intended to promote the flourishing of persons and to protect persons. That's most basically what law is. And if law is to do that, it has to operate according to a prior assumption or set of assumptions about what a person is, who counts as a person, and what constitutes human flourishing. And so when we drill down to that level of an anthropological analysis, I think that's where we understand the law most deeply and can either support it or critique it, or at the very least just understand its most basic premises. And what I argue, and so that's the methodological claim, is the anthropological inductive analysis, inductive meaning you simply take the law as you find it, is the richest way into American public bioethics, or for that matter, any area of the law. That's the methodological claim. The substantive claim is when you take that mode of analysis and you apply it to what I describe as the vital conflicts of American public bioethics, the law of abortion, which is primarily a creature of Supreme Court precedent, the law of assisted reproductive technologies, which is primarily defined as the absence of law and basically almost maximal space for private ordering to make a baby by almost whatever means you wish, not just make a baby, but select for a baby. I get into the book the way IVF and related adjuncts are practiced in the United States, and it's surprising how unfettered it is, especially compared with other nations around the world. And then the third vital conflict I take up is end-of-life decision-making, both the legal framework for discontinuing life-sustaining measures, or actually in those jurisdictions that permit it, physician-assisted suicide. And what I find when I analyze each one of those areas of the law anthropologically is that the vision of human identity and flourishing that is assumed by the law doesn't match the lived reality, right? The lived reality of our experience generally and specifically in these areas is the reality of embodied beings. We experience ourselves, one another, the world around us as embodied beings. We are bodies. We don't have bodies. It's not, whereas the anthropology that underlies the law at the moment closely tracks what others have described as expressive individualism. And Michael, being a scholar of literature, you'll recognize that from the Romantic literary era, in which a particular understanding of who and what a person is and what flourishing is becomes translated in the middle of the 20th century, observed by social scientist Robert Bellah in his book Habits of the Heart, and becomes adopted by normal people in everyday life. They believe that the fundamental unit of reality is the individual person, abstracted and separated from his or her web of connections or traditions or community or family, and perceives as the person as a kind of atomized will, the real us, the real me, is my will and my desire and my judgment and my cognitive capacities, and everything else, including my own body, is instrumental to pursuing my flourishing, which is defined as interrogating the interior of the self, finding my authentic originality, and expressing it, and then configuring my life plan accordingly. That's what human flourishing is under expressive individualism, and the laws in these three areas are built with that vision in mind, which is why the laws fail to protect the weakest and most vulnerable, because the reality of as Dr. Stigall, I think, will confirm, the reality of a patient suffering from a serious illness or dying or from a severe injury or a disability is not the unencumbered will seeking to assert itself in the universe and define its own future. It's a person who needs help, right? It's a person who is needing the care and concern of other people. And so I argue, and if you devise law for a disembodied will, and the reality is a needy, fragile human person embodied in time, the law is going to miss almost everything that person needs and what we all need to flourish. And so what I argue in conclusion is, if we take the body seriously, and drawing upon the philosophy of Alistair McIntyre and Charles Taylor and a little bit Michael Sandel, I argue that for embodied beings to flourish, what we need are what McIntyre calls networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, composed of people who are willing to make the good of others their own good. And to shore those up and to be participants in those networks, first of all, we depend on those networks for our very survival when we're born, and God willing, only later on in life when we're declining and moving towards the end of our lives. But a lot of us, in the arc of life, find ourselves dependent in a radical way. Some people are always radically dependent, and in order to take care of one another, we have to participate in these networks. But also, they teach us what it is that we're supposed to be, namely the kind of person who can make the good of another, his or her own good. Put most succinctly, I argue in the book that because we are embodied beings, by virtue of our embodiment, we're made for love and friendship. And for the law to be just and humane, it has to be built on those premises. And to shore up those networks, we have to practice what McIntyre calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence, as well as some other virtues that I identify in the book, the virtues of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, things like just generosity and hospitality and misericordia, that is accompanying others in their suffering, making their suffering your suffering, as well as the virtues of graceful receiving, principal among them gratitude, humility, openness to the unbidden, respect for imperfection and intolerance, openness to intolerance, imperfection, solidarity, respect for dignity, and honesty. Basically, the virtues and practices of authentic friendship. And so I argue in sum that the law in these particular areas is severely defective because it falsely assumes who and what we are and builds mechanisms to advance the flourishing of that kind of a being when we are a much more complex kind of being. Yes, we are free. Yes, we have minds. Yes, our cognitive activity is important in defining who we are, but it's not the only truth about us. And because bioethics and public bioethics is about fragility and limits and vulnerability and mutual dependence, the vision of expressive individualism is fundamentally asymmetrical and mismatched to meet those human needs. So that's the very brief summary.
Well, I would also thank Carter for doing this, Michael for setting this up, Carter for writing the book. The book's fantastic. And if you don't have your Amazon page up yet to have ordered the book, you should do that now. We'll wait. Okay. Thank you so much for letting me have this time. I very much enjoyed the book, and I think the book is very much needed. Dr. Snead, you and Michael also intimidate me, so I'm going to have some prepared remarks here. The title of Carter Snead's What It Means to Be Human, The Case for the Body in Public Bioethics suggests a work focused on contemporary issues. In fact, though, the book is a much needed but merely latest chapter in some of man's oldest stories about himself. But before I defend the notion that Professor Snead has effectively channeled Gilgamesh and Genesis, I want to thank him for several especially profound points in his book. First, the good lawyer reminds us that law and public policy are irreducibly normative. The importance of this point is hard to state adequately. The entire raison d'etre of law is normative. The law exists to protect and aid the flourishing of persons. And because of this, necessarily requires and puts forth an understanding of persons. What is a person? As well as what constitutes the good of the person. That is, law presupposes an anthropology and consequent moral philosophy and all that it does. In fact, law not only presupposes an anthropology and moral philosophy, as Carter shows us, it's one of the most fundamental mechanisms by which cultures inculcate their anthropologies and moral philosophies. And this is true even in a culture that explicitly denies the normative power of law, such as the one we currently live in. My second point of gratitude. Well, this one concerns Snead's explication of our current dominant anthropology, expressive individualism. He cogently shows the combination of individualism and expressivism is far worse than the sum of its parts. From its individualistic forebear, our dominant anthropology assumes the individual as the fundamental unit of society, free of unchosen attachments, living his life as he wills without past or determinate future. And from its expressivist side, we're taught that not only is man the measure of all things, but that the good life is just how well we are found to be living according to that measure. So the combination of these two errors yields an even greater error. As individualistic automatons, we're to make and master our own cosmos. But as expressivists, we must not only live our cosmos, we must be acknowledged to be doing so authentically by others. We are automatons who can only flourish when other automatons validate our flourishing. So this unfortunate offspring of this pairing are as diverse as cancel culture, virtue signaling, and Jerry Springer. Limitations of expressive individualism serve as the central theme of the book, namely that it is an anthropology wholly inadequate to account for the facts of our vulnerability or the obligations we feel vulnerable to vulnerable others. One of my favorite quotes is from Bertrand Juvenal in the book, who said, "Our dominant anthropology is one of childless men who must have forgotten their childhood." That's reason enough to go buy this book. It explains so much, right? In addition to these lofty points of philosophical wisdom, Snead gives us the most cogent genealogy of modern bioethics I know of. In particular, his elucidation of the major cases in US abortion law is absolutely fantastic. Equally fantastic is his showing that the principles at work in abortion law infect American jurisprudence elsewhere. The privacy rights invented in Roe, the liberty rights aggrandized in Casey, the equity rights slapdashed in Carhart are found in case law far distant from abortion rights. And lastly, I'd like to thank him for reminding the world of Alistair McIntyre's book, wonderful book, Dependent Rational Animals. It's a book dear to me in both areas of my professional work. And as a teacher of bioethics, it's been required reading since I began teaching because of how well it expresses the importance of embodiment. And as a pediatrician, I find it to be the most clear explicator of the virtues of parenthood that I know of. So I'm a fan. And because I'm a fan, I think Professor Snead's latest offering is so important, I'd like to push him on 2 points. First, I don't think the scope of the project to correct these errors is given near enough foreboding or dread. It is true that expressive individualism is incoherent and absurd, but this does not make it inefficacious. This anthropology has been wildly successful on its own terms and worse in objective measures as well. This anthropology of choice, license, and gratification really has led to a world of more choice, less encumbrance, and more ways to pursue passions. And even more damaging to those who would speak truth to its lies are the facts that we are also healthier, wealthier, and more efficient than other alternative worldviews. How do we argue with a regime that looks to be the first in history to conquer a plague? And even when grounded by obvious errors, it still gave us a vaccine in 9 months. In addition, the book is way too kind in its comments on medicine's collusion in these false narratives. One would hope that a profession devoted to the understanding of the body would be a potential ally in the fight against falsehoods about the body. In fact, the same errors in anthropology abound in medicine, and actually, I think were instrumental in the turn to modern medicine. It's through our errors that we become modern medicine. In the end, we end up giving you a vaccine in 9 months. So I think the corrective task is both wider and deeper than I wish it were. And this is why I think the anthropology of embodiment offered as a corrective itself needs to be wider and deeper. The book does a brilliant job at showing the failings of expressive individualism, especially for the vulnerable and dependent, which in fact includes all of us. We are all born vulnerable and dependent. We are all likely experience vulnerability and dependence even in our prime. And when we age, we again live out yet other forms of vulnerability and dependence. But is this account enough? Is it enough to appeal to justice? That because we were weak, we are weak, we will be weak, we must therefore take care of the weak among us. At times, the book does offer more positive appeals. Snead tells us that our embodiment shows that we are a species made for love and friendship, for example. Our weaknesses therefore provide the conditions for the possibilities of our greatness. But I think more C should be covered on this tack. Our embodiment isn't a curse, it's a blessing. Aquinas tells us that man is the greatest of animals, but least of intellects. Our intellect neither knows perfectly all it can know, like God or the angels, nor creates in its knowing, like God alone. In contrast, these perfect intellects, Aquinas lets us know that ours is discursive. We encounter an entire world of unknowns and must move through our ignorance in steps, some of which end up being in the wrong direction. And for many years, I took this as a gentle rebuke to our temptation to hubris. But I've come to realize that our place as discursive reasoners is as perfect as it is necessary. As embodied minds, the world we live in exists in time and flux. A discursive intellect is the perfect intellect to move through such a world. The point can be made from our social nature as well. The two most remarkable features of our species' sociality are how vast and complex our relationships are in our mature state, but how immature and helpless we are in our infancy. We are so social that the only species that can even compare are like bees, ants, and wasps. No primate nor any other mammal comes even close to the social connectedness that our species has. But we accomplish this from a period of immaturity that lasts longer than any other animal, and not just a little longer, orders of magnitude longer. We are the most helpless animal on the planet when we're born. We become the most interconnected species on the planet after experiencing the most prolonged period of helplessness on the planet. These features are not unrelated. In fact, I think they're causal. Some speculate the reason our species babies are relatively undercooked is because our brains are too big and wouldn't fit through the birth canal in our mature form. But I don't find this persuasive. I think we're born exactly at the right time. We need to be born in such a state of immaturity because the complexity of our species' social bonds can't be acquired in utero. They must be experienced in time, discursively, ex utero. We bargain the planet's longest period of immaturity in exchange for becoming the apex species in every environment we've ever entered. Our immaturity is definitely imperfect. In our youth, we are not nearly what we can be as perfected adults, but this imperfection isn't thereby a defect. It's a necessary stage of development to a species that looks unlike any other on the planet. So this dialectic that my modest suggestion seeks to give to this fantastic book is actually the same dialectic our first stories tell us. Genesis' first creation story tells us that man was fashioned on the same day as the rest of the animals, implying we are very much like them. But the second creation story tells us that we're the animal that names all the other animals and thereby are given dominion over them. We're called images of God because of our ability to reason and command, but errors in those same abilities remind us of how incomplete, frail, and fallible we are. Our first and greatest stories know that we are both beast and God, and therefore neither. There's a pensée by Pascal that makes this point far more eloquently. Number 418 says, he says, "It is dangerous to make man see too clearly his equality with the brutes without showing him his greatness. It is also dangerous to make him see his greatness too clearly apart from his vileness. It is still more dangerous to leave him in ignorance of both. Man must not think that he is on level either with the brutes or the angels, nor must he be ignorant. He must know both." So thank you, Carter, for offering us this well-timed, absolutely needed book. I think we have much work to do, and this will surely aid in this important fight.
Thank you, Dr. Stigall. For a few minutes, I'm going to moderate a conversation between Professor Snead and Dr. Stigall. And during this time, I invite participants to continue adding to the Q&A queue by typing your questions in the Q&A box. I was hoping first, Professor Snead, if you'd be interested in sort of taking up either of the two, not exactly challenges, but responses about Dr. Stigall made about how do you argue with the regime that just defeated a plague. I thought that was very pointed and well put. And how you take his discussion of embodiment as really his emphasis on embodiment as a blessing, as a gift, and sorry, vulnerable.
Yeah, no, those are wonderful. First of all, Dr. Stigall, thank you for such wonderful and thoughtful remarks and challenges as well. I'll speak to both of them very briefly. I'll speak to the second one first. So Leon Kass is my mentor and beloved friend. Trained as a physician and molecular biologist, taught in the humanities at Chicago for a very, very long time with his wife, his amazing wife, Amy, and was the chairman of President Bush's Council on Bioethics when I was the general counsel to that body in the early 2000s. And when I was talking, I had dinner with Leon, I don't know, a couple years ago, and was telling him about how I was thinking about the book, and I was sort of focused on the limits of embodiment in that conversation. Like, we've got these natural limits, and we're vulnerable, and we're fragile, and so forth. And he looks at me across the table. He's like, "Yeah, but if we weren't embodied, we couldn't have hugged each other when we met each other today." And as always with Leon, a light went on, and the gifts of embodiment, both for the sake of helping us to become the thing that we're supposed to be. I couldn't agree more with William on that front. And I think that, I think the idea that our embodiment and our dependence is actually makes us what it is that we're supposed to be, that we're most human when we're being taken care of and when we're taking care of others is a fundamental argument. And I think, and what I try to make in the book, and the book is basically both in the context of abortion and assisted reproduction. It's a book about parenthood, right? And parenthood is the network of giving and receiving par excellence. I mean, as William said, in Rational Dependent Animals, McIntyre spends a lot of time talking about the parents of disabled children as the exemplar of practicing the virtues of acknowledged dependence. And I couldn't agree more. It's a very beautiful point about the gift of our immaturity and dependence in infancy compared to other species. That basic, because the truth that a parent must take care of one's child, not because you've agreed in advance to do it, not because it enhances your life plan, but rather because that's what it means to be a parent, right? It means to be a parent is to take care of that child. You don't have to have a pre-existing, agreed to obligation to do that, right? That's an unchosen obligation. And then sort of the correlative of that is the child doesn't have to earn the right to be cared for. Right, the child doesn't have to earn the right to be sustained and cared for and kept safe and fed and taught and everything else. And that to me is, again, I think that's a beautiful example of how we learn in the first instance, the very first network of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving that we encounter is the parent-child relationship. And that's what abortion aims at in a violent way. That's what assisted reproductive technology corrupts and subverts when it's practiced in a completely unfettered way. as it is in the United States, as I describe in the book, where children are made the articles of commerce and embryos are sold in batches, and we do sex selection and a whole wide variety of other things that that we do because there is no law in this space to give people guardrails to protect them from unscrupulous practitioners, but also to protect them from their own temptations, right? Anyway, I completely agree. I think it's exactly right. And it's funny, in my discussion with David Solomon at the fall conference, with the winter conference we just had, he asked me, why don't I talk about justice more in the book? He said, you only talk about gratitude. You only talk about love and gratitude. And I said, well, I talk about unchosen obligations. That's a kind of argument about justice. But William puts his finger right on it. The fulcrum of the argument of the book is about gratitude and remembering one's dependence and seeing oneself in the other, and in gratitude reaching out to the other and being humble and caring for others and participating in these networks robustly, making the good of others your own good. The first point is, I'm not sure that expressive individualism has actually been successful because it's impossible to live, because it's so false, right? It is dislocating, it's disorienting. You can't live as an atomized individual will. And one of the reasons why you can't, even under the auspices of expressive individualism, William put his finger on, namely, you need someone else to acknowledge your expression, right? You can't, if I'm just speaking into the void, expressing my originality into the void, that's not the kind of flourishing that expressive individualism has in mind. It has in mind someone receiving that message and responding to it and affirming it, and that it basically puts the lie to expressive individualism in the first instance. It contradicts itself. You need others even to recognize and listen to and respond to your own expressions of your deepest inner truths. And you also mentioned, William, identity politics. I think that is actually a function of people trying to live expressive individualism and then finding it doesn't work, right? Because you have to have an in-group identity. You have to have some kind of community that you're attached to, that you define yourself as, and then of course define other communities that you're opposed to and cancel them and make whatever case you can. I mean, a lot of what our kids see, probably not at the University of Dallas, but at other universities, there's a lot of anxiety and stress on these kids to figure out what their identity is, how do they identify, and how can they fit themselves into the cosmos of identity politics, where they're on a white hat and not a black hat. You know what I mean? That is a good guy and not a bad guy. These are the same people that are trying to live their freedom, and they find that they can't do it in isolation. So, and I do that. One last point about the plague. I hope that we've conquered it. But the second point is, the one thing that I think I was impressed by wasn't so much what it took to generate the research and development and removing all the regulatory strictures and funding private industries and the sort of collaborative work across lines, which strikes me as more of a collective activity in terms of research and development. But even better than that has been the way we've allocated the vaccine. We've tried to allocate the vaccine to the weakest and the most vulnerable, at least in Indiana, that's what we've tried to do. Each state has its own authority. And we haven't done it pursuant to those who are most cognitively able, those who are most beneficial by the lights of expressive individualism. And that's been a kind of relief. The idea that we've at least tried to have a sort of preferential option for the weak and vulnerable, the oldest, the most at risk, and those that take care of them.
Dr. Stigall, I wanted to ask a question that I think will help you also to respond to Professor Snead's point. It has to do with what's happening in medicine on the ground, however you want to define on the ground. So if Snead argues that expressive individualism is, say, the background assumption of bioethics law, would you say that that's also the background assumption of the practice of medicine? Professor Snead uses this phrase, forgetful of the body. It feels impossible to say that medicine is forgetful of the body, but is there some truth to that in what you see as a practitioner?
I think there's a similar tension that he points out that, expressive individualism is objectively false, right? For all the evidence Professor Snead gives, we know it's false, right? And then we know it has, faulty philosophical bases, right? So you can see it fall apart from both sides in the universal and then also in the particular. Medicine has a similar tension that our understanding of the body is divorced. Our understanding of it is divorced of the meaning of the body. And in fact, the real issue, I think, that makes it so hard to get at is we become modern medicine by forgetting the body, by forgetting the meaning of the body. When we cast off Galen and Hippocrates and say that we're no longer just going to accept disease, right? We're going to actually do something about this. That's when medicine starts to explode, right? And it's only when you can start to look at the nature of the body in the same way you look at the rest of nature, which is now the modern turn is the nature is to be conquered for the relief of man's estate, right? That we need to turn our minds onto our environment around us and to attack it so that we can get along better. So we don't have the long 500-year plague. And medicine then takes the same tack that the body is this thing we work on. And that naturally fits into this expressive individualism, that the body is this thing you work on for what purpose? Well, the classical understanding of that would be, well, for its own purpose, for the purposes of the body. You know, health is a well-working in the organism as a whole. And so you do things as a physician that help the body act as a whole, right? The modern turn says, well, you fix the body for the workings of the mind. And so whatever it is that your mind wants your body to do. So the reason why you don't like disease is you don't like the way it makes you feel. The reason why you think that you want this bone set is because it doesn't let you be the mountain climber that you want to be, right? But if you divorced it from the body has its own nature, it's not a very long walk to get to, I'm in the wrong gender. I want to live forever. I want to, this body is now a shackle on me. And so in the day-to-day, physicians take care of bodies. And in the day-to-day, they have some inchoate notion that like disease is not just of the body. There's also something psychological there. There's something sociological there. And pediatricians, we know, like the whole idea of autonomy in medicine, we pay it lip service and we act like it's true, but no pediatrician really believes it, right? Everyone, when your 7-year-old says no, they don't want the vaccine, it's not the same thing as a 17-year-old saying that, a 27-year-old saying that, a 77-year-old saying that, right? And so we know this in our day-to-day practice, but then if you start drilling into why, you know, why can the 7-year-old not really say no and the 27-year-old can? What is that? Then we had to fall back on the received wisdom of bioethics, which is autonomy, and we make up some stuff about autonomy and substituted judgment and that sort of thing. But we don't have a flourishing alternative. So the anthropology that Professor Snead's presenting, it's forgotten in medicine as well. But again, I think the real issue here is not just you can't teach them, which they're hard to teach, agreed, but it's the forgetting that actually made us so successful. And that's a real problem, I think, for people who want to do this kind of work.
Michael, can I ask a question? So I'm so glad that I have such a smart and insightful physician, like somebody who actually does medicine, that we're having a conversation with. It's really, it's great. We just had my first bioethics in the law seminar this week. And one of the things that we read is Gil Mylander's amazing essay in his fantastic little book, Body, Soul, and Bioethics, on how the bioethics lost the soul is the title of the chapter. And it's his critique of, it was on the 25th anniversary of the Hastings Center, and it was his critique of where bioethics had gone. And he gives a really short but interesting and penetrating account of the Georgetown principles and casuistry and all the different competing approaches to Ezekiel Emanuel's sort of communitarian bio. It's it's like a devastating critique one after the other. And he says something, he says, but and this is where we started. The first question to my students was, okay, Mylander talks about what a profession is, right? And the idea that for a profession to be a profession, the learned practitioners have to have something that they're actually professing, right? It's not just a technician. You're not just there to work on a machine. Although I completely agree, William, that thinking of the body as a machine has unlocked unbelievable success in treatments and interventions and biomedical science. While at the same time making the physician sort of more humanly distant from the patient. But the question I asked the class, I said, well, so what you're professing as a practitioner is the notion of, and what you're serving is the idea of health. And you mentioned this a second ago. What do medical students and practitioners and community learn together what health is? How do they define health? Because the expressive individualist would say, health is what my truth says health is. If I feel incomplete because I have a healthy arm, I want the doctor to remove my arm, and that's the appropriate way to intervene in that setting. That's serving my health, as opposed to, you used a very nice definition. I won't get it right, but something like the range of species-specific functioning in the normal organism as defining kind of an objective standard, objective range for what health is. How do they? The thing that worries me most about medicine, and the thing I'm not an expert in clinical medical ethics, and that's mostly what I do, is, you know, the sort of public bioethics piece. How do doctors understand what they're doing? You say they've forgotten it, but what do they think they're doing, and what do they think health is?
Well, I mean, the truth is, right, we never actually define health. The bioethics that's generally served at medical schools is fairly thin. You know, it's a survey course of, there's some deontologists here, and there's some consequentialists here, there's some feminist ethics here, there's this guy Aristotle, but we don't really understand what he's doing. But these are all just of a piece. You could, you know, pick and choose, and people will. And so you kind of need to understand what they're doing to understand that there's these different normative theories, right? So we actually you don't ever get a class on what is health. So what you get is the apprenticeship of what is health, which is, it's the lack of disease, right? So all you see in medical training, especially on the inpatient services, is disease. Disease is disease is disease. And you don't need to define it, right? You know that's dysfunction. So, you know, what's a healthy cholesterol? Well, it's a cholesterol below a diseased number, right? So it's all in the negative, via negativa, which gets you pretty far, right? The lack of disease is one necessary way at health. But then, so what is disease? Well, disease is normatively defined, right? Life's a bell curve, and 595 is going to be one end and the other, and normal is here, and disease is out here, right? And that too also can get you pretty far, right? If you want to know what a normal blood pressure is, you need to check a bunch of blood pressures. But then there's hints that that's not enough, right? That there's hints that, like, maybe even a lower cholesterol is not going to kill you 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or a higher cholesterol is not going to kill you 2 years or 5 years from now. But there's some number that actually is even better, that you have longevity rather than just not dying soon enough. So we're picking it apart backwards, and via negativa. And that said, there is more in the sort of the holistic realm, the integral realm. People are understanding that, if in the social sciences, if you don't have friends, you die earlier. You know, if you lack purpose, you die sooner. So we're finding these truths, and there is a rebirth in this. The problem is there's also quackery, right? So these kinds of the whole body, the whole integral notion of mind body, that also is very susceptible to quackery, which then means that the science argument against it is super powerful, because you look a little stupid if you really believe this stuff. And as physicians, we definitely do not want to look stupid.
I wanted to ask a question of Professor Snead that we have a lot of questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try to group a few of them here. So several people wish to hear more about the anthropology of embodiment. So one person asks, does your anthropology of embodiment include our relational nature? And we get another question that says, how does one actually go about remembering, unforgetting the forgetting of the body that undergirds expressive autonomy? There are a lot of ways to go with this, but Professor Snead, I was wondering if maybe there would be a way for you to kind of elaborate at least on one or two of those virtues of acknowledged dependence. You have this long list of them, and those are some of those beautiful parts of the book, especially its prose, because it really is you laying out a sense of, as you say, not an apodictic proof, but a rhetorical persuasion to say, wouldn't you want to live this way? And so I was wondering if you could talk more about the anthropology of embodiment, and what you think it might, how it might make a difference for the way that we live, and how we might go about what are some of those practices, goods virtues that might help us get back to remembering the body more than we currently do today?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And so in the book, the sort of response to the deficits of expressive individualism in anthropology, I posit an anthropology of embodiment, which conceives of a person as a dynamic unity of mind and body, not simply a body like a machine, but like a dynamic unity of mind and body. There are truths in expressive individualism about we are individuated, we are free, our cognition is important to who we are. But it's not the whole story, and it's not the whole story for everybody in the human family and everybody in the human community, because we all, as McIntyre says in a beautiful way, exist on a scale of disability. Like we have the best we can hope for is an arc of total dependence, increasing strength and independence, and then a gentle decline back into dependence again, right? That's the best we can hope for. Most people have more intermittent periods of dependence. And so because what characterizes our lives as embodied beings are mutual dependence, vulnerability, and natural limits, that means we are already set in relation to one another. That is to say, we depend on other people for our survival and then for our flourishing, to teach us what it is that we're supposed to be. McIntyre calls it independent practical reasoners. And when you reflect on that, when you think about how your very life depended on other people making your good their good without expecting anything in return, it should engender a sense of gratitude, right? It should engender a sense that you really are here because of the beneficence of others. And if you cultivate your moral imagination a little bit and remember your own vulnerability, you can see in other people their vulnerability, and in your gratitude and humility that your recollection of your own vulnerability engenders, and sort of foreseeing your vulnerability again in the future, it engenders a disposition to practice those virtues that shore up and sustain these networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving, namely the virtues of just generosity, right? Being generous to other people in proportion to their need, just by virtue of their need, by virtue of our common membership in the human family, by hospitality, caring for the stranger because he or she is a stranger, not because you have some contract to take care of strangers and this person meets the criteria. Like you just do it, right? And then misericordia, which is a very beautiful virtue, which is kind of the flip side of making the good of another your own good. It's making the suffering of another person your own suffering, and to seek to try to care for them, to ameliorate their suffering, or just accompany them in their suffering if that's all that's possible. Those are the virtues of uncalculated giving. And again, your one is motivated if you reflect in an honest, intellectually honest way on your own history and your own future. That's what it really means to be a human being, is to take care of each other. So yes, we are situated in relation to each other from the very beginning, including especially in the womb, right? We are, whereas Harry Blackman defines the sort of the human context in which abortion arises as a clash of strangers, echoing Judith Jarvis Thompson's work on the violinist and her work in defense of abortion, which I talk in the book, where a woman is kidnapped and anesthetized and wakes up with a violinist attached to her kidneys. And that's what Judith Jarvis Thompson understands pregnancy to be. Right. One person supporting the life of another person who's an invading stranger. And the question is, do you have an obligation to do that? She says, of course you don't. You don't have an obligation to support someone else's life unless you consent to do it. And my argument is that ab initio, there's a relationship of mother and child that has meaning. It's not an atomized clash of strangers over scarce resources. It's actually a mother and a child in crisis. And when you recharacterize it in that way, it's a summons not just to the people immediately around them, the father and the family and the community, but to all of us, right? When we hear a mother and a child are in crisis, when we're functioning properly, when we're thinking rightly, we run to their aid, we help. That's what it means to be a human being. How do we get out of this individualistic mindset? I mean, it's tempting. It's very sexy, right? To imagine that you are the sort of Ubermensch with a will to power that you will impose on the universe around you to realize the goods that you've discovered that are transgressive of the community in which you live. That's a sexy image, right? But it's not an image. It's Satan in Paradise Lost, right? It's the idea of the will to power that doesn't remember being created, that doesn't believe they have any creaturely obligations, and they're just going to blaze a path to glory as they define it. That's not who we are. That's not who we are. And practices that take us outside of ourselves, and nothing takes you outside of yourself more than parenthood, man. Like taking care of a baby that is not in any way reciprocating the affection that you're extending to it, or taking care of a sick person or an unconscious person. And just to be clear, you can participate in the networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving merely as a passive recipient of unconditional love. It doesn't exclude anybody. It doesn't exclude the comatose, the child who has severe brain damage, the child in the womb, the dementia patient. Everybody's part of the family. And you're exactly right, Michael. I'm not demonstrating a proof that everybody has to agree to, although I think it is compelling. It's like, wouldn't you rather be that? Wouldn't you rather be someone that loves and is loving other people? Isn't that a more beautiful way of living than living for yourself in a purely selfish, instrumental way, where even family relationships are transactional and instrumental? And so, practicing gratitude, practicing kindness, cultivating the moral imagination. These are the ways we get outside of ourselves. We draw our gaze upward and outward rather than focusing on ourselves and our own interior will.
Yeah, I think not just the individual practice of those things, but as social beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can encourage
Mm-hmm.
that in others. And the parenthood is absolutely 100% right. That so Maria Montessori, right, says the child makes the man. And she means the obvious, that men come from children. But what she really means is that men aren't really men until you have a child. And that's true biologically, evolutionarily speaking, but that's true psychologically, right? That I am a different person after I had my children than before I had them. And as a pediatrician, when I was in residency, I didn't have a kid yet. I used to be kind of offended by that. Like parents would ask me, well, do you have children? It's like, well, no. I mean, what do I need kids for? I know all the stuff, right? But now I know, it's a great question. And they knew that. And so there's ways then you get at the abortion argument then, right? One of the ways you get an abortion is say, well, this is just unjust. It's an organism, it's a person. You don't have the right to do that to another person, right? The other way around that, though, is the pro-life argument ought to be, well, listen, like, yes, it's going to be hard, but you are going to be better. Parents are better people after parenthood than they were before. And this is just a historical fact, right? I mean, it's just the way the species works, the way culture works. And we do, I think, a really good job. We've elucidated the arguments about the violent nature of abortion, and it's just not fair. It's not just for one person to do that another person. We've got those arguments down, but that's not really the tragedy, right? The tragedy, yes, tragedy is there. The real tragedy is that you think to be a good person that involves getting rid of this other person. And in fact, this may be the best thing that's ever happened to you. And on average, it is. On average, men are, I mean, you as soon as you get married, your insurance goes down. And this is for a reason, right? You're less stupid when you're married. And we now have good neuroscience data to explain this. Like, men's frontal lobe really does become more complete when you get married, when you have kids. That's why you work longer, you make more money, you get in less fights. And so we have tons of sociological data that I think are just super compelling, that this is what we need to be basing society on, of this understanding of the human person who is better, faster, stronger, healthier, wealthier, wiser when they have kids. And instead, as your book really does really well, that is the exact opposite of the lens we look at parenthood through.
Yeah, and so there are two things I would say in response to that. I completely agree. So my becoming a better person, I'm still not a good person, but like I was a bad person before I got married, and then I was still a bad person, but a little bit better. And then having kids, I'm a less bad person than I was before then. And that illustrates, and just to be clear, I mean, I'm sure those in our audience who don't have children, who wish they did have children or aren't married, haven't found that special person yet. And those folks shouldn't, I mean, there are a lot of special people who can be good without having children. And that's important to say, but the person that is most present in my mind when I think about and talk about this is Mother Teresa, right? She didn't have any biological children, but she sure had a heck of a lot of children, in the sense of people that she gave her life to in a completely selfless fashion. I mean, and that, by the way, is ultimately, and you're talking about persuasion, that ultimately is what persuades people. That kind of self-sacrificing, pouring out of oneself to others is what confounds the modern sensibility. Why is she doing that? There was a funny story. Somebody said to her, you know, you couldn't pay me. I wouldn't do what you're doing there for $1 million. She's like, yeah, you couldn't pay me $1 million to do this either. That's not why I'm doing it. If it was just about the money, I would be doing something else, right? And so taking care of those folks as she did. And, you know, and so, but like when she gave that speech at the National Prayer Breakfast, that pro-life talk in front of then President Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and Ted Kennedy and everybody else, and she said that abortion is a grave violence against the child and give the children to me, I'll take them. Her voice had a resonance that mine never, ever will. And that's because she lived it in a way and was a witness in a way that is a saint, right? I mean, and so that's an extraordinary thing. And just on a lighthearted note, in the book, I'm a fan of the TV show The Office, both the British and the American, but the American is really special for those snobs that think the British is better. And Pam Beesly, one of the female protagonists, is talking about how soft being a parent has made her. And she says, you know, I used to watch Pulp Fiction and the gimp would come out, the sort of bondage slave would come out and I'd laugh. He's like kept as a prisoner in this basement of this horrible pawn shop. He's like, and I would laugh, there's the gimp. And I said, but now I look at that gimp and I say, that gimp is someone's child. And it's like a complete reorientation and reconfiguring of your imagination about who you are. Everybody you meet is either a parent or a child, and our obligations run in those directions because we're all kind of on the same team. How would I want someone to take care of my child if I wasn't there, you know? And last point, Steven Spielberg made Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And at the end of the movie, he has Richard Dreyfuss, who's a family guy. He's a family and a wife and kids, who's obsessed with UFOs. And he gets on, sorry for the spoiler, but he gets on the UFO and flies off with the aliens at the end of the movie to realize his dream of exploring what it means to be an alien and learning more about them. And as a dad, I'm watching that. I'm like, what is he doing? He's got a family, he's got kids and a wife. What is he doing? And Spielberg, funnily enough, gave an interview and said, you know, I wrote that in 1977 before I had a wife and kids, and there's no way I would write it that way now. I just couldn't do it. He's like, that's not how I see the world. So anyway, I don't mean to keep going on and on about it, but that's a long way of saying I agree with William.
We've found ourselves in the realm of theology and Catholic practice. And so that's where I wanted to go for the last, we have 2 minutes. We'll see how far we get.
2 minutes.
I want to point out, so in the comments or in the questions, several people are moving the questions in that direction. So Dr. Roy Hine, a pediatrician himself, points out that, you know, that the power of John Paul II's law of the gift, as opposed to the comparative stinginess of the law of beneficence, as he points out. There's also questions around ensoulment and thinking about ensoulment and whether that's a theological category that has any power or purchase. In some of the questions around is ensoulment the same thing as becoming a person, would be one way to think about that question. And then the last one is from Far Curlin, who really just wants to go there. So I'll just read you his question, Carter. Yeah. And I'll let you respond in about 90 seconds, and then we'll take it out.
I might just read you his blurb of the book, which is right here. Yeah.
And he writes, you are a Catholic Christian. How does the story of what Christians call the incarnation develop the account of what it means to be human that you propose in the book? So can you give us a brief sketch of how you'd think about that question?
Yeah, so I am a faithful, I try to be a faithful Catholic, and it's the most important thing to me, and defines everything about me and my family, what I try to be and do. The book is not overtly religious. It doesn't make those arguments, although as any person who understands our church's teaching would understand that everything in the book is our church says more beautifully, right? Like the parable of the Good Samaritan more beautifully and more succinctly says exactly what I'm trying to say in the book. Who is my neighbor? And Farr is a brilliant physician and teacher and bioethicist. And before we started filming, I said to William, I said, you know, I'm worried that we're not making more Far Curlins, and we need to do that in order to preserve the integrity of the practice of medicine as a humanistic endeavor and as a profession. And so what Jesus does in the incarnation, I mean, if anybody needs to make the case for the body, all you have to do is point to the incarnation. The idea is that God became man in an incarnate way and changed and sanctified the body in a way that obviously it would be impossible otherwise. So by virtue of the fact that God is not merely a spiritual being or an episode, but actually, you know, the son became a man, I think is just further confirmation about how essential the body is to our identity, how holy it is, and how important it is, and it seems to me that you just merely signaling to that. And to answer Farah's question, I think the incarnation is absolutely essential for us Catholics and Christians to reinforce the importance of the body to our identity and what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God.
So thank you to both of you for joining us today. To everyone here, we invite you to join us for our next event, which is called Action, Contemplation, and the Liberal Arts. This features Jonathan Sanford, our provost and incoming president at UD, Dr. Blakey Bermule of Stanford University, and Dr. Jennifer Summit of San Francisco State University. You can register at the link in the chat. And finally, as we have heard today, we live by gift, we exist in networks of interdependence, and I invite you to practice one of the virtues of acknowledged dependence by making a gift to Liberal Learning for Life at UD. If you like this event, if you think we should do more of these, if you want UD to be the kind of place where rich, serious conversations like this can happen, I invite you to let us know by sending me an email or by making a gift to the program. And you can do so at udallas.edu/liberallearning or by going to the link in the chat. Again, thanks to you, Professor Snead and Dr. Stigall, and to all of the participants for joining us today. And we wish you all a great afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.